Back in the day, if you wanted to build your own custom controller, sure, you could buy the lever and buttons somewhere, but where do you get an enclosure, and more importantly, where do you get a control board? Well, back then you probably just take apart an old controller and use the control board that's in that and solder directly to that control board. Well, that's not an approach that's very amenable to beginners and people that just don't have the equipment to do all that soldering. So, what are other options? Not much back then, but nowadays we have plenty. So, it kind of started with the PS360 Plus and some other control boards. And then around 2015, Brook came on the scene, and now you have all sorts of control boards from them. But then, people want options, right? So with the dawn of the RP2040 chip, the GP2040 project came available, and some boards based on that also started being developed. And now there's the GP2040 CE, or Community Edition, not to be confused with Champion Edition. And there seems like an onslaught of boards from all sorts of folks. And we have an assortment of them here. And that's what I'm going to be doing in this video, is reviewing their options, their features, their strengths and weaknesses, tell you what you should be looking for in your GP2040 board, and see if this project is for you, maybe it's not for you. We'll go through all that. So stay tuned. So just for the sake of completeness and to also compare to Brook boards, I want to show you the dimensions of the Pico Advanced Breakout board. So starting with length, we're showing about 3 3/4, maybe a little bit more, about 95 plus millimeters, give or take, right there. And then we're going to be doing the height here, just shy of 2 inches, or about 48 millimeters. And just in case you have a really tight fitting case, this measures at about just shy of 1/2 inch, or just over a little bit of 1/4 inch. So in terms of millimeters, that's going to be about 10 millimeters high, or thereabouts. So just so you have that in mind if you have a really tight fitting case. So let's compare this to a Brook board. So as you can see, these are pretty much identical. If I put the retro board on top, yep, it's going to fit pretty much exactly. If I do the reverse, yep, there's no real difference in size between these two. So they are compatible, not just with the 20-pin layouts that they have, but also in the size. So if you have, say, an all Fightsticks case that uses the mounting board for Brook boards, then the Pico board will fit just fine. I want to show you guys real quickly how to install one of these boards, and you may be changing out a different board, and so we'll show you that really quickly as well. Anyhow, I've got the Eternal Rival mid-tier here, and I've already removed the screws with the Phillips 2. And I'll need a Phillips 1 for this guy. Of course, removing the card from your existing build will be different depending on what you have. But in this case, this is going to be tricky to show, but all those buttons are wired into there. So what I need to do is just get a Phillips 1 and undo what's here. This may work well, this may not. You just want to unscrew your current board, and especially with a setup like this, I need to be careful not to push too hard or crack acrylic or do anything silly like that. I may need to reach underneath and hold the nut that's holding it in. So this guy, it's a real trip. Anyway, with a little persistence, you can remove that. The other alternative is just you go from the underside. These are being held on by nuts, so I would just use a nut driver to remove that. A lot of setups, it's just going to need a screwdriver, and that's pretty much it. Now, let me show you a little bit less messy angle. So from here, I have removed the 4 nuts that were securing the board.
And before I take that off, I do need to unplug the cables that are already here. So remember their orientation. Red and orange are going to be over here. So for your 20-pin harness, if that's what you're using, just kind of rock it back and forth while you, and make sure you're pinching at the connector itself. Never pull by the wires. That's a big no-no. That should make it loose. Don't go too far. You don't want to bend the pins, but just back and forth while you kind of pull up firmly, but not like a savage, right? Anyhow, you're going to want a small precision screwdriver for this, and the USB connection is easy enough, but let's get to that in a second. For these JST connectors, just kind of slot the screwdriver in and use it as a lever and push it out. Never pull by the wires. Once again, it can snap and then you have a useless cable without repair. All right, the last connection I have is this USB, so just slide that out, easy enough. If you have screw terminals, you're just going to unscrew them enough so that you can pull the wire free. That is an instance where you can pull by the wire as long as these are loose enough. So if it's not coming out with just a little bit of force, then loosen the screw some more. Otherwise, if you had a stick select, it's pretty much the same as this connector. These are DuPont box connectors. Works, just hold by the box and kind of lever it out. Anyway, we're free. So let's remove that old 0-pi. And because I was sent this to review originally before I went nuts and bought 5 more, I'm going to slot this in, and we're going to just put these retaining nuts on. Now, I do recommend that you start in one corner, go to the other corner, and then do the opposite. Now, if you have a nut driver this small, I do recommend you can tighten it a little bit, but of course, don't go crazy and over tighten it. You'll make yourself very sad. All right, now to install our cables, just do the opposite. So plug in our USB-B, and this is the 4-pin harness, so we want to match that to that port. When you're doing this, you can again just press like that until you should feel it go flush and click. And once again, let's match our red and orange to pin 1 and 2 there. Just kind of wobble it on slowly but surely until it's nice and flush, or as close to it as we can get, and then we should be good to go. Let's make sure everything else is connected, and then we'll reassemble this case. Just a quick follow-up note, if you are using one of the USB-C boards, you will need to have a USB A to C cable to replace the B to A cable that was in here. So what I'm going to do first is look at every board individually, and then I'm going to get into some comparisons. So we do have some old versions to new versions here, and I want to show you the differences, what changed, right? How did they evolve? And then finally wrap it up with a group shot to kind of compare them all at once. We're going to start off the individual reviews with the Pico Advanced Breakout Board version 4, which was the original board we were sent to review. And yeah, I'm sorry it's been this late, but I have bought 2 of the train's other boards, so please forgive me. Anyway, let's get going. I still think this board has a lot of things that for current revisions just don't have. So, might be something if you see pop up on a used listing, don't sleep on it maybe. Anyhow, Just like all the other boards in this roundup, we have a screw terminal set up top, but there's two extras here. One is labeled T, one for G, so I'm imagining this is for a turbo key. So you can set that, but it doesn't label the pin, so I'm not sure how that gets set in the back end in the web config. Questions for later. Anyhow, we have a web config button, so you can plug this in while holding this and you'll jump straight into web config. That's great for when you want to configure it before you put it in your stick, which it's a nice thing to do. It's not totally necessary, but you can make sure it works. You can update the firmware, do other stuff with it. Anyhow, we also have a boot select, so if you need to copy the new firmware, you can do that too. But really, if you can boot to the web config, generally you can just dump the firmware. However, if you screw things up, having a boot select button is nice because you can dump in the flash nuke, get it all reset back to 0, then dump in the freshest advanced breakout board firmware, and then put it, you should be golden. So that is a nice touch to have. All right, starting over here, we have some more screw terminals, and these are labeled ground, up, down, left, right. And as well, there's also stickless 5-pin. Now, the stickless 5-pin is not labeled as far as what it is, but I'm imagining this might be ground, and then you just repeat. It could be the opposite way, so I'm not sure. It's not a big deal. You would just flip it, and then you should be good to go. Obviously, the intent here is we hook up a hitbox and you just want to plug into that. That's great. You don't have to worry about wiring from here. Or let's say you have a hybrid stick like I have a lot of, and you just want to, instead of tying it to a terminal block, which I usually do, I could tie it to here, my alternative inputs, my button inputs, and then I don't have to worry about, okay, I need to wire separately to here, or do some terminal block like I mentioned, some other setup. I just have it wired into here or here, and I'm good to go. So that is nice. I know a lot of times we'll recommend you just wire 2 of them into the same screw terminal, and that's workable, but what if you want to go back and change out wiring or something? Then you have to fish out your wiring from here, and that might be messy. Instead, you could just unplug from here and do whatever. All right. Anyhow, below that are some RGB LEDs connections. That is a 4-pin. So there is that connection. Most all of these have some iteration of that. So I'm expecting it'll work with that WS LEDs. I have to look up the exact model. Anyhow, let's go looking around the bottom row. 20-pin down here, standard connection. We have them labeled, which is nice, and also these are labeled, which is also great. 4-pin harness for that, touchpad L3R3, or in this case A2. Expansion. This is labeled ground 3-volt, and this is your I2C expansion. So if you've seen those little displays and those little hit boxes that are sold all over the place, Etsy and AliExpress, that's what they're connecting to, or using the pins of. Obviously, they're not using this board, but you can achieve that same effect. You can go out by the screen, make a wire, connect it to here, and there you go. Next up, we have your stick select, 3-pin, and 2 option ports. Those are 2-pin. One is set for, well, it's just labeled option 1, 2. It doesn't say which specific pin that's tied to, so that might be a little bit of hit or miss as to what you need to set. I don't like that. And you have a 5-volt out, so if you have something like a digital joystick that requires the extra power, you can connect it there instead of wiring it into here. Usually they come with a 2-pin JST PH to 2-pin JST PH. You can do it that way, which I think is a little cleaner. It's nice. For connections, we have USB-B, as you can see, and also a USB direct. That is labeled nicely: ground, data plus, data minus, and power. So we're doing pretty well so far. These are the unique features right here, is that you have separate connections plus 2 extra screw terminals for ostensibly turbo, though the pin here is not really designated, so I'm not sure how that might work. Okay. There might be more documentation elsewhere, but I do like it being on the board just so you know. All right, I think that's enough for the Advanced Breakout Board version 4. Let's move on to our next contender. All right, let's move on to the Barnes Industries Advanced Breakout Board version 5.3E. Now, I know the Train designed this, and there's a number of resellers. Buttercade has a red one. Barnes has this white one. The Train, I think, has a standard greenish one, or maybe a black one. So they are out there. They were originally designed by the Train / Arcade PCBs. I just got mine from Etsy from Barnes Industries, and I think it looks sharp in white. Anyhow, let's go ahead and go around the board. So here we have the standard screw terminals, and of course we've reduced that from the 4.0. We don't have that turbo and ground anymore. We have an expansion. This is the I2C expansion. It's just relocated up here, still 4 pins. We have our stick select, and this has curiously gone to 4 pins, a different connector, but that's okay. The 2 middle pins are just ground, so you don't really need one of them. We have a 3-pin RGB LED, and those are labeled, as is everything else here. This says 2 ground 3, so I'm not sure what pins that would connect to. I probably have to experiment with it. Anyhow, that's all labeled, which is nice. These are labeled still as well. That's great. 4-pin harness, so again, your touchpad, your R3, your L3, they're all here. And that's the standard with Brook as well. So if you have that cable, you don't have to worry about fitting it to here. It'll work. All right, and then right across we have option. And the nice thing is these all have the required pins. So if I wire something to option 1, it's 23, 2 is 24, 3 is 26, 4 is 27, 5 is 28, and 6 is 29. So we're getting pretty much the maximum number of options available here. Here we have a 5-volt out, so again, if you have that optical joystick that needs it, you can wire it straight in here instead of having to worry about, okay, where do I get VCC from? And speaking of which, I don't see a VCC port up here, but you could always get it from here. Or, just grab it there if you need it. USB-C connectivity for this one. And there is a USB direct. I did not have this soldered when it arrived. It came empty, and I just soldered a right angle header. There's also a debug set. I was going to solder a connector in, but then I thought it might get in the way of my right angle. Nice thing about a right angle here and where it's located is if you put a right angle and you want to do a dual stack like I'm planning to do with this, and you have the Brook Retro, for example, this doesn't produce as much height when connecting that USB connector it has. We also have, these are unlabeled, so one is web config, one should be boot, or boot cell, and one should be reset. I know they come with the diagram, but I really do like it on the board. So, when I'm just opening up my case and I want to press a button to reset it, I can do that without having to remember, oh, which one was this? So, otherwise, pretty much everything is labeled here, which is very nice. But yeah, I think that's pretty much the 5.3E. Now, as of this recording, the 5.4 is on the horizon in October of 23. So I know that adds a USB port to plug in a Magic Boots adapter, and there's all sorts of goodness with that. So let's move on to our next one. Up next is the Arcade PCBs Ultimate USB Pico Fighting Board, and this is available on the Etsy shop. Well, this version is no longer is, but the version 2, which we'll be covering momentarily, is. And yes, this is version 1. Let's start at the top with, the screw terminals are pretty much standard. I think we have at least one extra here for our 5-volt. So if you need that power connection, there you go. As we'll see, we don't really have a extra power outlet. So you either have to use this or you're going to have to use the power pins on your 20-pin. RGB LED, standard 4-pin with this guy, and then you have your I2C here. 20-pin standard connection here, 4-pin standard here. Stick select 3-pin, kind of standard here. We've seen a couple different implementations, so me saying standard is kind of awkward, I know. We have 2 option ports, and yes, the nice thing is these are all labeled, so it's very small though. I'm wearing my reader glasses and it's tough for me. So we have one that looks like, I want to say it's 31, 20, it's really hard to read. I'm going to have to break out the magnifier. But the pin is labeled. Just make sure before you install that you write that down if you are using one of these. And then we have a turbo reverse, so that's more dedicated. 3.3 volt, data plus, or no, turbo LED, sorry. Turbo key and ground. So it's kind of like a standard Brook setup there, which is nice. However, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah. Turbo LED is 13 and 14, it looks like. So you have those pins. Again, I would double check this with a magnifying glass because it is tiny. All right, USB direct. And I believe, did I solder that in? I believe, yes, I did. So this does not come soldered in by default. That is something I put in. However, it is labeled, so that's all great. USB-C connector, as the title of the board implies, correct? Anyhow, we have all 3 buttons, which is a great comfort for me. I like having more options, right? So you have the boot select if you really need to blow this away or update the firmware, you can do that. Reset and web config. So that's all good. This is, besides maybe one other in this roundup, the only one that has a turbo full 4-pin implementation. But when you have the options in the back end to just do it that way, it's maybe not as necessary. There's no other power outlets on this that most of the others have, so you have 5 volt here and 5 volt here, but no dedicated port for if you have a digital joystick. All right, let's move right along into the version 2 of the Ultimate USB-C. And again, this is by Arcade PCBs. Starting up top, we have pretty much the same screw terminal array with 5 volt on the end. All good there. RGB LEDs, again, 4-pin. I2C, still 4-pin. 20-pin is still, 20-pin. 4-pin harness, you know the drill. Stick select, 3 pins, same as last time. These are just crammed together. The big difference really, I think, is you now have 4 options. So we just got rid of that turbo reverse and made these whatever you want them to be. So you have a little bit more flexibility with the version 2. So they are, again, very small print here. And there is one port on the end, 3.3 volt out. So we do have a power out, but it's not one you can really use for much, given most optical joysticks are going to be 5 volts. So I'm not sure why the 3.3 volt, other than you're powering a single specialty LED. I don't see it getting much use, but maybe I'm wrong. You can tell me in the comments what fantastic devices need 3.3 volts, and I will amend my statements. Anyhow, circling around, we have USB direct. Now, I soldered this in once again, so it does not come preloaded with that, and I can use a proper JST-XH header if I had one. I just went for DuPont pins because that's what most things use. If I was going to dual mod this with a Brook Retro, then it comes with that DuPont style header, and it's just easier to plug and go instead of re-terminating it. I'd have to buy a whole new kit. I don't want to do it. I have enough stuff as it is. Anyhow, USB-C connection, as you'd expect in a product called the Ultimate USB-C Edition. And again, 3 buttons, boot cell, reset, web config, all labeled very nicely. Yeah, this is, I think, overall an improvement, but we'll talk about that later. Up next is the integrated Pico fighting board by Jason's Customs. Now, I believe this one is the most Brook-like fighting board, so if you're using a lot of the Brook option connectors, then you might want to take a look at this one, as it's more an easy transition to GP2040. Anyhow, let's get started. So up top, you have your standard 20-pin connector array, and these are not labeled here versus the others, which are. I'm a little disappointed by that, but however, Jason did something pretty interesting on the little container here, anti-static bag, sorry. You have a scan code that goes straight to his documentation, and the documentation he's put together is some of the best I've seen. So that's excellent. I want all of you others that are selling Pico finding boards, please take note of this technique, or it doesn't have to be a sticker. It can be a simple slip of paper that has a scan code for your documentation for that board, and maybe a scan code for the GP2040 CE site. Just something, please. A lot of these don't even have really much of anything. It's pretty much, oh, just go to Discord. I don't wanna. If it's late night and I'm trying to put something together, I'm on the road, I don't have ready access, maybe. I just want to be able to, go straight somewhere or be able to download a PDF to my phone and keep it with me. Not have to dig around in Discord. Discord is not documentation. Okay, rant over, I promise. Anyhow, after the screw terminal, let's start going around. RGB LEDs, this is a 5-pin connector versus the 4 and 3-pin we've seen before. This is not an issue, but it is different, so you may need to plan accordingly if you plan to plug in some of those. Anyhow, a standard 4-pin I2C expansion, and neither of these are labeled on board. Again, I know, I'm going to try and control the tremors I'm feeling. 20-pin connector, again, not labeled, so yeah, I expect this is pin 1 over here, pin 1920 over here. I don't expect anything different really there. Okay, up next is a unique feature for this board. If you are a fan of the status connector on the Brook, you use that BitBang Gaming player status LED board, I like them, then this is the only board in this lineup to feature this. So that is great. And they are labeled. They don't have the pins really labeled. I just see, those are resistor labels, so that's not it. You will have to reference the external documentation to get this completely set up if you plug these in, but it's not too hard. All right, up next, and I said this is the most Brook board-ish like guy because of these 4 connectors along the bottom, because the next one is your standard 4-pin touchpad L3R3, and then you have a standard turbo connector the same way Brook likes to do it. So again, if you want to replace, say, maybe you're replacing a 0Pi, you just want the GP2040 goodness, then you drop this in and you had those connectors, connected, then you can just unplug, replug, and you're set. All right. Up next, reset button. Okay, pretty standard. And we have a course, a little boot cell button up here, but we'll get to that. We're using USB connector here. This is 1 out of 3 boards that has it in this lineup. You also have a USB direct, and this one is labeled, so that's thank you. I'll just say that. It does use a different connector than standard, though. This is a JST XH. Usually we're using these PH connectors. However, I believe that width between these pins, if you are using the kind of Brook one, if you're dual modding with, say, a retro, and use the standard 4-pin DuPont connectors like the boxy ones, then it should still work in here. The pitch should be the same. But if you have XH and you want to crimp that way, hey, be my guest. All right, these last 3 connectors I soldered in myself. They did not come connected. Now I believe the latest revision does have this guy preset, so you're good there, and there's a reason for that. First of all, this is a debug connector. Not likely you're going to use it, but I had connectors, I had solder, I went to town. You have this boot button, so if for some reason you want to put yourself in boot cell mode and you want to wire up a button to do it, you can. Not sure how many people really want to break their stuff in the middle of the match by having a button they could press, but you have the option. This guy here is a special connector, and it's not, the pins are labeled, but basically what it is now is if you've heard the GP2040 has a USB pass-through adapter, or it's being integrated into the latest version as of this recording in the, I believe, 5.4 revision of Train's advanced breakout board. Well, Jason is coming out with his own, and that's going to be available in October, and it's going to be connected to here. Now, once again, I believe the latest revision of the integrated Pico fighting board has this connector pre-soldered in, so you don't have to worry about it. These two are not going to be soldered in, so there's that. But there you go. Anyhow, that's pretty much the features. We don't have any option ports. We don't have any power ports, so yeah, this is the most Brook-like. You're not going to get a lot of bells and whistles out of this if that's what you're shooting for. If you just want a plain Jane GP2040, I just want to pop it in, put my 20-wire harness, plug my USB in, and go, then yeah, this is just fine. However, future expansion quite a bit limited. Our last contender in this shootout is what I call the wild card. It is the Reflex Encoder by Mr. Add-ons, and that's not MR dot add-ons, it's Mr. as in the FPGA game emulation hardware project. Anyhow, let's get going before I go too far into that, and let's get started. So yeah, we do have the standard screw terminals, and they are labeled, thank you. And we also have a 5-volt and ground connector here, and that's kind of your DuPont 2.54 millimeter pitch connection here. So that's okay. We've got one again. That's nice to have. If, again, you have that optical joystick, then this could be a choice for you. Also here, I had to solder this in, but we have a boot button connector. So I'm guessing this is boot select. So if you want to put your firmware on here and update it, you could connect a button or jumper it and then plug it in, copy over the firmware, let it update, and then take it off. And there you go. So, given that you can usually get into the web config, this you may not have to solder it in and do all the fuss. It would be nice to have just a button for this and call it good. Okay. Anyhow, let's go around just like usual. And I call it the wild card because you see that we're duplicating some connections here, and this looks identical, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And everything here right away that's striking me, except for the screw terminals and these two, are pointed straight up. So if you have a case with limited vertical height, this board may not be for you. Yeah, it's going to be a problem just because all your wires, all your cables are being pointed straight up. Which most cases you'll have the room, but if you have a really tight setup, then this may not be for you. Anyhow, let's start over here. RGB LEDs, 4-pin, and we have a duplicate. So if you're using that DuPont style connector, the box one, then you can use this. But if you have JST-PH, you can use this. I would not use them both, just because I don't think you're going to have enough power to go around, and it may not support it. Anyhow, and below that, again, I2C connection. I'm going to issue the same guidance, I'll just say. Don't use both. You pick one and use it. Down below here, standard 20-pin, and it is labeled. Thank you very much. I am glad that these are labeled very nicely, except for this, which we'll talk about in a minute. Right here, we have turbo connectors, and they are split out, so 2-pin, 2-pin. I imagine if you don't want to use turbo, want to use an extra button, you could, set out the turbo button as something else, but it does look like they are labeled as far as what pin they're using. However, it's really hard for me to read. I need to break out a magnifying glass. Here is your touchpad R3, L3, and ground. This is labeled as a future expansion. However, looking at the same thing on the integrated Pico fighting board, I'm wondering if you could use that PS4/PS5 USB pass-through thing on here as well. Questions for later. All right. Up next, you have something called Anna L, Anna R, and ground. This is a stick select. You are not going to get analog. It's just going to let you pick from, left stick, right stick, and directional pad. Here, this looks like an option port. And then we have 1 press for reset, 2 presses for programming mode. So that's nice to have. And it's kind of classy that they managed to get it, dual function button. So that's cool. All right, for connections, this is the most, full-featured out of the roundup with 3. So you can go USB direct, you can use USB-B, and you can do USB-C. Don't do more than 1. And that applies to all the boards in this roundup, because otherwise you may be putting too much power in it if you connect multiple at the same time. Just don't do that. Just connect one. Be happy with it. Finally, I said this guy was the wild card, and it's probably because it has some wacky connectors, but these two are definitely different. You have one that's labeled Sanwa, one that's labeled Famitsu, and they're JXT XH connectors. So if you have those, you want to connect your joystick specifically to that, you can. Or, there's nothing stopping you from, if you've got a multiple control situation here, you have a hit stick, then you could wire this to your hitbox buttons and then use the 20 pin or this to wire to your joystick as normal. Whatever way you want to swing it, this just gives you a little bit more flexibility, and this just has the different pin out for Famitsu. So that's nice. I'm not sure how many people are going to use it, but it's there. So, it's not. I don't think it's going to emulate like a right stick. So you're probably not going to be able to set it up for Robotron or anything like that. All right. That said, I think that's covered their Reflex fighting board pretty well. I don't think I've missed anything. Let's move on to do some group comparisons. Let's get started with our side-by-side comparisons, starting with the advanced breakout boards. And if you take a look, this is, again, version 4, version 5.3. Version 5.4 is probably going to be out by the time you see this, but I don't have one to review. So there's that. Anyhow, this definitely has an older feel to it with the soldered-on Pico board. Not that that's bad. It's not going to affect performance, really. But it just feels bulkier, not only because of this, but because you've got more screw terminals, and you have some over here, USB-B connector, whereas this guy is just so slim, and it just, lost a few pounds, lost a few screw terminals too. Yeah, we don't have the turbo and ground over here, but you can always replicate it on any of your option buttons there. And went to USB-C, so if you are using a Brook connector, that's going to be USB-B. You'll have to get an adapter or different cable to connect to a pass-through. That's not too big of a deal. Just poke around on Amazon. You should be able to find one. Anyhow, so one thing we did lose is this alternative connector. It is labeled as a stickless 5-pin. You could conceivably connect a joystick, but is it really a big loss? I don't feel like it, because you can always use the screw terminals or the 20-pin connector for different sets of controls. So it's not a huge loss in my opinion. We still keep the RGB LEDs connectors, but this goes to a 3-pin. So if you were to take this out and drop it in and you had that connector before, you just have to, hopefully you don't have to rewire everything, but yeah, it is something to note. Anyhow, we still have a I2C expansion. It's just moved places. Still have 20-pin. We do have a lot more option ports. We have 6 on here versus just 2 here. And we keep the 5-volt port, so that's nice. We also keep the USB direct. However, this is pre-soldered in, or was pre-soldered in. And this I had to add myself. We also have a debug, though most people are not going to use this. You will have to solder it in there. So just something to consider. And again, we move to USB-C, and now we have 3 buttons. though. Two of these are not labeled. One is reset, one is boot select. So there's that. We do have single button on both to get in the web config. And these are a little bit, trimmed down. Like these are a little bit bulky, but it's not a button you're going to use much, so durability is not a super huge concern. But they are low profile, which is nice. Other than that, this is still a good board. It's just you are trading, some of the things around here for option ports, and you just have so many more than you do here. Let's move on to the next comparison I've got, and that is, well, we have another evolution, the Ultimate USB version 1 to version 2. All right, taking a look, these look pretty identical. I mean, every connector there, USB-C. These are slightly different, but it just really looks like the color of a button more than anything. And they haven't changed locations, pretty much all the same place. These two connectors, 20 pins. It's only these JST connectors that have changed. So if you notice here, they're a little bit spaced out, and you have two add-ons and a dedicated turbo/reverse. Whereas here, you just get 4 add-ons and a 3.3 volt out. Once again, I'm not sure how good a 3.3 volt out is. I'd rather have a 5, but there you go. Now, really all we're doing is taking this turbo reverse and breaking it out into add-on 3 and add-on 4. So there you go. Conceivably, you could kind of do the same thing here, although this pin here is probably dedicated to power. So I would be careful about using that as, well, anything else. Otherwise, it's not too much of a change, honestly. Sure, you're consolidating this and being less flexible, perhaps, but I mean, when you break it out into the same thing, if you already have the 4-pin turbo connector that you've been using, and then you have to rewire everything, it's not great. But if you are doing a brand new install, then yeah, this has a little bit more flexibility over this. So really not a giant upgrade. I would have just called this a 1.2, 1.5, because it doesn't feel like there's that much of a jump, but that's me. The last comparison I want to make is, well, just something outside of this review, and that is a Brook board. I did mention that the integrated Pico fighting board is probably the most Brook-like, easiest drop-in replacement here, and I just want to demonstrate that. So, screw terminals. I don't know if they are the same layout, but it would not surprise me if they are, right off the top of my head. Anyhow, these two connectors, yeah, they are different, and this guy does not have a stick select. I should have pointed that out earlier, but I'm pointing it out now. You have the same 20-pin connector as all of these do. And from there, it's really, again, these 3 connectors that makes it so similar. You have the status panel, same here. Then you have your L3, R3 touchpad, same here. And then you have your turbo, there you go. You do have USB direct. They are a little bit different there. However, if you had a 4-pin here, you could use a 4-pin here, be fine. USB-B is the same. Other than that, there you go. There are these 3 extra connectors, but in most cases you're not going to use them anyway. So yeah, if you have that use case where you are using a lot of the Brook additional connectors, not a lot of people do, I feel, but there it is, then you may want to consider the integrated Pico fighting board. All right, we're here for the group comparison, so let's get started. Now let's go with the Advanced 4.0, and obviously the difference is pretty clear, right? This guy looks very industrial compared to the rest. You have the soldered on Pico as opposed to the integrated chip on all of these. You have a lot more screw terminals. You have a USB-B port, which half of these have, half of these don't. So there is that. Otherwise, 2 options, which kind of matches this and exceeds actually these 2. So you can do a couple things with it. A 5-volt out port is nice. It's all seen right here. I don't believe anybody else has a 5-volt out port. So that's handy, especially if you have, let's say you want to run LEDs that are not, they're just kind of generic LEDs that are on or off. And you're not using this header for some reason. Or the more likely application is you have something like a Paradise Magenta joystick, and that needs 5 volts of extra power. So that having this is, it's nice. How many people are going to use it? I don't know. But you also have the regular RGB LED, so that's great. Otherwise, I mean, you're not going to find this most times because, well, it's an older revision and there's no real need for it. If you find it one-off on a Discord somewhere, someone's telling, oh, I used Pico board or something like that, okay. You kind of know what you're getting into at least. And yes, this is the only board that has the extra connectors for an alternate layout. Say you're doing a hit stick layout, you can connect the 20 pin or the screw terminals and these. However, how advantageous is that really? Not really, because honestly, on most of these screw terminals, you can either double up or you can use the 20 pin and the screw terminals. So I can see why it was dropped. Let's talk about the 5.3 then. All right. So right away, again, I've said it before, this is a massive slim down, and yeah, integrated Pico, USB-C is doing most of that lifting, but some reduction of the screw terminals also just lends it to being a little bit slimmer. Now, you don't have a 5-volt port here on the screw terminals, but you do have it here, which I think is a nicer implementation, especially if you're using a Paradise Magenta. You can plug that 2-pin cable right to here and get power instead of doing screw terminals, which I think are a little bit not as clean. So there's that. It's kind of an aesthetic choice. This board has the most option ports. So if you want to put in a turbo LED, a reverse button, kind of that antagonist button once again, and a function button, etc., here you go. You have plenty of option ports to make those dreams a reality. And me being me, I like to use as many as possible, and I probably will in my build. Now, you don't have these 2 ports soldered in by default. Again, I put this on. A lot of these, like I had to solder this one. This one was already here on here. This one was already here on here. This one was here. So yeah, if for some reason you need it and you don't have soldering equipment, then you're going to have to find someone who does, take it to a makerspace, do whatever, because this is not going to have it. Otherwise, you do have the 20-pin, screw terminals, etc. So very rarely do people need this. Usually, I think the use case is dual modding with a, say, Brook Retro or another board. And yeah, there you go. So overall, I really like the 5.3E. It's a great evolution. Can't wait to see more evolutions. I know the 5.4 is already on the horizon as of this recording. So there's that. Let's continue with the USB-Cs. All right, let's cover the ultimate USB-Cs. And again, the version 1 is not something you're going to find for sale except for, maybe some random one-off on Discord, who knows. Whereas right now, the version 2 is what's going to be listed on, say, the Arcade PCBs Etsy shop. All right, so is there any reason to consider these over, say, the 5.3? I don't think so. It's just, even on the version 2, you only have 4 add-on ports, and for some reason a 3.3. I'm not sure why 3.3. Sure, you have a 5-volt option up here, but I think it's just nicer to have it as a JST connector. Again, the USB direct are not soldered in by default, so if you need them and you don't have the equipment, you need to find some way to work that in. Otherwise, you still have a good board overall. This is not a bad board. It's just, why would you spend the money on these guys when this has all the features and then some? Unless you need absolutely screw terminals for 5 volt versus using the JST. So I recommend the 5.3 over these guys, but these are still not bad boards. Let's move to our second to last contender in this, the integrated Pico fighting board. And once again, this guy is probably the most Brook-like in its implementation. There are no real option ports, which is kind of the most disappointing thing here. I think if you're looking at GP2040, you want to try some new things, you want to push the limits, and this is almost not doing that, right? Because we don't have any option ports. This is something nice, and I'll talk about that in a second. But otherwise, you have pretty standard ports here, other than this being a 5-pin versus like the 4-pin or 3-pin found elsewhere. This is useful, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Also, USB-B. Again, it's kind of that let's fit in with Brook mentality. So if you want that drop-in replacement, you got it. Now, this is the only board, once again, to have compatibility with that BitBang Gaming status light. So if you're using that, you want to continue, or you're thinking about using it, but you want to keep GP2040, this is an option. Whereas, nope, can't get it anywhere else. Otherwise, this is a standard connector, that's a standard connector, I2C, RGB, once again 5-pin. I just hate that a lot of these pins aren't labeled, so we don't know what they are. Yes, you can go to the documentation. Yes, theirs is pretty good, and I've already said it. This is the only one that came with here's a scan code. Just scan it and go to the documentation as it's current. I want everyone to do that. Not just to go to the GP2040 website, but to your own documentation. What's these pins? What do they do? Simple stuff like that, right? If you have an installation video, great. Then link to there, whatever page you're going to use. But please have some documentation. All right. Now, let's talk about this port since I alluded to it. Now, these guys, at least I know these three, probably will work here, but I'm not sure. If you may know, there is an add-on, here it is, that is going to let you plug in a Magic Boots adapter so you can use your stick as a PS4 controller on the PS5, which will work for most games, I believe, so there you go. If you need that PS5 compatibility, this is a route to getting it. However, Jason has his own thing, shown here, coming out in October, so it's probably available as you're watching this, and have fun connecting that. You just need that Magic Boots little dongle and you're set. So that is a nice advantage, just having that dedicated port. Now, if you have an earlier revision of this board, this is not soldered in, so once again, you're going to have to connect that. However, once you've got it, there you go. Later revisions should have it in there, according to the documentation on the website. So there you go, you're set. Otherwise, yeah, I can't really recommend it over the other boards because the power of options here just, yeah, I feel like that's what we're after when we're doing GP2040. Sure, having the status connector is nice, but it's burning up all those option pins according to documentation. Pretty much the things that get used here all get burned up right there. So it's sad, but that's kind of the name of the game there, right? You have only so many pins you can use, and we're using them. So, all right, let's move on. All right, let's cover the odd duck in the lineup, and that is the Reflex fighting board. Now, this is a slightly older revision, the 1.1. The 1.2, I believe, fixes an issue where one of these pins is reversed. That shouldn't be, but there you go. Now, you can correct that within the web config. So, if you're pressing right, you're going left, and then you just flip those pins, and you're good to go. All right, once again, definitely in comparison to everything else, all these ports except here, here, and here are pointed straight up. So if you don't have a lot of vertical clearance in your case, that's an issue. But if you have plenty, then okay, this might be something to look at. However, we're kind of duplicating features. So it looks like we have a lot of ports, but are you really going to double up on either of these? I don't recommend it. right? We're not really getting two of these. I would recommend only using one. If you like the JST connectors, you can use that. If you like the DuPont connectors, you can use that, or depending on what comes with other kit you're using, if that's the case. Yeah, so you do have that flexibility, but I don't know if it's going to be much of a feature for a majority of people, right? Yeah, you do have this unique Sanwa Famitsu connector, but you have to get a JST XH connector, or you can probably use the DuPont standard connectors as well. I just don't see it getting used that much unless you are doing, again, kind of that hit stick setup where you have multiple directional controls and you just use this as an alternative. So it's a possibility, but I don't know. I'm not sure I'm sold on it as a feature. We do have this connector, and I alluded to it earlier. I was wondering, hey, is this going to be kind of pin compatible with this? No, that is not the case. So they do label this as future expansion. I don't know what they plan to do with it. If anything, I guess we'll just have to see. We do have one option port, but that's it. So choose wisely, I guess. They do intend this for use primarily with Mister. It is GP2040, so you can use it with other compatible systems. But I just don't get the logic of cramming these in the way they are. I don't know. It's just me. Now, this does obviously have the most connectivity options to your pass-through, assuming you're using one, than any other in this lineup. So you have USB-C, you have USB-B, and you have USB Direct. Please only use one of them. You don't want to overload the board. They do advertise, well, speaking of, that this has, I believe, TVC protections, protection against overloads and such, but I don't really have a way to test that. This is also the most expensive board in the lineup, costing around $45, which is about a little less than double what these individual boards are. To be honest, it's hard for me to, if I want to rebuy this, I don't know. I just say, why? You don't get as many options. Most of this is straight up, so I can only use this as a single board in a system. Yeah, it's just, I don't know. I do like that things are labeled. I mentioned that already. Some of these don't label each and every terminal or connector, but this does a pretty good job of that. I do like this, having a single or double press to save a little space. Would like to see a boot select mode, though. That's kind of here. You have to do, an external button, whereas others, you just have a button. So, well, that would be boot right there. If anything was a button, I'd say web config, but since you can just hold start, plug it in, and you're set, not terribly useful, So just the additional ports, I feel are a questionable value, since you only use one or the other. And these, I struggle to find, the real value. How many people are actually going to wire that way when you're using a 20 pin or using this? Most of them don't, most of the cables out there don't terminate in JST XH, so if you want to buy a ready-made one, I don't think you can. Not sure if Mr. Add-on sells their own set of cables to work with this, or they expect you to make your own. So there's that consideration as well. Overall, yeah, it's a weird one. With everything just pointed up, and these two guys, and this stuff, it's just a strange little board that it's kind of like weird for the sake of being weird, without necessarily adding value, perhaps. If you watched any of my other videos for the arcade stick, you know I'm a big stickler for documentation. Just having that manual there is such a comfort to me. When I'm evaluating a controller, and especially those that connect to multiple systems and always need some button combination or slider switch or whatever, it's always useful to have something that says, okay, for a PlayStation 4, set this here, set this other switch here, or what have you. For a controller PCB, it's definitely good to have a diagram of what does what and any caveats as to what to connect and what not to connect.
So let's use Brook as a control so that we can compare it to that experience versus what I've received so far. Now, the first thing about any Brook board you might buy is that they come in a pretty professional package, right? Not only do you get scan codes to take you directly to the user page or firmware page, you also get a printed manual in most of them. So that's already something we're not really getting at a lot of these boards. And what I want to do now is just go through the online experience, because that's usually how I'll end up doing it. When I'm building in my room, I'm just going to pull out my phone or a tablet maybe, and then say, I need to remember what this does on the 20 pin. So let's go ahead and do that. And I'm just going to search for Brook Pico Fighting Board Manual. And what I'd like to see is something within the first 5 results. And right there, 0 Pi Fighting Board. And already I can get to the user guide, and it wants to download. That's fine. But I also have access to the firmware. And over here on the firmware download page, if I'm looking in the right place, yeah, I have a manual for how to install that firmware. So it's all here. It's all authoritative. It's very nice. It's easy as all get out, so makes sense to my dumb brain. I'd like to see what we can do with the others and where they're at. Let's start with the Advanced Breakout Board 4. So I've got the search terms loaded. I could try GP2040, but I feel like this is probably the best search here. And we have something from Reddit. And we have something from Etsy, but most everything else here is not too helpful. Remember, I'd like to see it in the first 5 results, and I don't think we're going to have... Yeah, we're not even having anything on the same page here. So let's see if those turn up anything. All right, this is just a release announcement on Reddit. Not exactly a place I want to go to for long-lasting documentation. Here's an Etsy page. We know it's sold out. So we'll look at the item details anyway. And yeah, here's a GitHub. Not really confidence inspiring. Okay, there is some documentation here. So I would grab this as soon as possible if you have a 4.0 and copy it to your personal notes. Who knows when this might disappear? You never know. But yeah, this is definitely not the most confidence-inspiring thing so far. But sometimes that's the open world of open source. Okay, let's give the 5.3 a go, just to see if we get any differences. It says related. Let's pop that open. This looks like a reference to 3 or 4. Raspberry Pi, not really a reference. Yeah, we're way past the 5 results rule, unfortunately. But let's see what this turned up. Okay. This is schematics. I think this is a little overkill for most people. Like, I'm not going to be able to read it. It's not mapping exactly to what connector does what. So there is that, but there's a pinout. Oh, I have to log in. That's kind of unfortunate. Yeah. So that's not terribly informative, I feel. I know we have the GP2040-CE.info site, and that's more the software side of these. It's not the hardware side, what connects to what. Sure, most of these are labeled, but I would like a kind of documented reference for these that describes, okay, you can use these pins for what. So this is the one I specifically purchased. It was the Barnes Industries variant, which is just a white variant, really. I think Buttercade has red. There's another one that's purple out there. So there is not much here. I don't know if that's going to actually help me. Let's see. This GitHub. Again, GitHub, it was linked, I don't know. There is some information here, like what's labeled expansion, labeled toggle. So that might be a good reference, but I feel like this is not the experience I want to have. So I'd really like to see, perhaps on the GP2040 site itself or somewhere related, here's a manual diagram for these connectors. Here's how to connect them, what not to do, etc. The minimums you need, and so on. Just we'll kind of see an example of this in a bit, but so far, not feeling it too much. All right, let's move on to the ultimate USB-C and see if we get lucky there. Okay, custom, yeah, this is almost not even related. No, these are, so once again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, these aren't really related at all. I'd have to go track down the Etsy page or my order I went from, and I'm not feeling good about that. Let's try something else. Okay. Well, I just went and changed one term to Fighting Board, and here's a link to at least the 2.0. Not on sale anymore. Again, I feel like it's going to be consolidated just into the mainline advanced. So let's go see the details. Docs. Yeah, this is kind of about the software, but and once again, an Etsy page that's expired like this, I would get in there and copy the documentation here. Definitely. There is some documentation about what, okay. Turbo, what pins the add-on pins are. Okay, that's good. So I'm definitely going to save this for myself. But otherwise, yeah, again, this isn't the experience I want to have. And I know documentation is like the last thing people want to do, but it is what's going to help sell your board, I feel. Next on the list is the integrated Pico Fighting Board, and I've already said it, this is the best experience so far. Right out of the box, it came with a scan code, and yeah, I'm going to show why this is so nice. One, yeah, even if I manually search here, number 2 result, and that's huge. So I'm not trying to search over and all creation here, all the internet, trying to find, okay, where's the documentation for this thing? So if we go in here, there's actually 2 documents down here that are very, very useful. The first is this overview. I'm going to pop that in a new tab and show you that in a minute, but also this setup document. And here's what it wants you to set things for in the back end, the web config. So let's see exactly what numbers to use, what pin numbers to use in each of these. And if you want to have a turbo button, here's what to set. Here's what to set for LEDs, and so on. So this is extremely useful. Now, the other document here is also extremely useful, and this is what I really hope other boards aspire to, is exact pinouts, what each of these pins do. And it also tells you, hey, I can use WS2811B LEDs, which is fantastically useful. So that's, there are so many LED strips out there, so knowing which one is compatible is huge, and you don't have that documentation elsewhere. At least not that I've seen. Yeah, this board does not have all the connectors as they ship. Like, you'll have a screw terminal thing, so that would be nice to have an updated one with how it's shipped currently. But I feel like that's a minor gripe because the major things I want covered are covered. 20 pin is covered. The screw terminals are covered. Even what each GPIO pin is covered, which I feel is icing on the cake. Yes, you have that other document I showed, but having them referenced here in case you have some weird setup or some weird mapping thing you want to do, it's all available here. Icing on the cake, this GP2040 link is clickable. It takes you right there. So if you want the main documentation for the software end, it's all here. So this is the best experience so far, by far. I'm just not finding much, if anything. So this is really nice, and again, I hope others aspire to it. All right, let's wrap things up with our final board in the shootout, and that is the Reflex Encode fighting board. Now, right away, search turns up #1. That's great. Thank you so much for that. So Google got it right, and the Mr. Add-ons folks got it right. So it comes right up, and that's fantastic. Now, here's why I kind of get let down. PCB source files are here, but is that really going to show me what I want? There is a quick reference, so that's nice. Okay, that's something. It's not bad. So I have GP2040 reference pins, or at least not really pins, but what they refer to things as, S1, S2, or select star, or what have you. So, all right, we have something. That's a far cry better than a lot of the other boards in this lineup. Not as pretty as the integrated Pico fighting board, but it gets the job done, so that's nice. Also, it shows you how to update the firmware, which definitely plus there. I like that. And how to get into the web config, so that's nice. What else? Go back to the main page. It also has comparisons of the board layout from version 1, version 1.1, which is what I have, and 1.2. It also notes the little bug they have with swapping the left and right pins, which of course you can do in the back end, so that's all good. Other than that, it's a runner-up. It's not as great as integrated Pico fighting board, but at least it has a lot more than our other boards in the lineup, so maybe I just missed something for those 4 boards, but I don't think so, unfortunately. All right, we've compared them 6 ways from Sunday. All right, who are our winners? Well, overall, I think you guys know, but my overall choice is that 5.3, and with 5.4 coming up, that may also be on your radar. However, right now, I think this is the best overall GP2040 board for you. You just have so many options. It's lightweight, it's clean. Yes, you do have to solder a couple things in if you need them, which 99% of people won't. But otherwise, you just have all the features you want, and then you can customize it the way you like. All right, what about runner-up? Well, I'd have to give it to the Ultimate USB-C version 2. With 4 options, it's not bad, and you're running at a price point that's still pretty good. However, given the advanced Breakout Board 5.3 and above exist, this feels redundant, right? With a 3.3 voltage out, though you have a 5 up here, I don't understand the value there. Yeah, they both have USB-C now. This made more sense when the advanced Breakout Board had USB-B, but now that they both have C, why? They both have, these ports and etc. But with reduced option ports and only a 3.3 out, yeah, I know, again, there's 5 up there. I can't recommend it over the advanced Breakout Board. All right, taking the best documentation and most Brook-like award, yep, you knew it, integrated Pico fighting board. If you want that status light, this is the only one to have it, and you have Brook-like breakouts there. Curiously, you don't have a stick select, which Brook usually does with the kind of DuPont connector 4-pin. So that's absent here, which is very curious omission. Otherwise, you have USB-B for compatibility with the Brook board, but not any options, so there's that. However, again, best documentation other than worst board labeling, so I don't know. And finally, the Odd Duck Award, you know what it is, the Reflex Encoder. This guy just is very vertical, let's just say that. So as long as you have a case that'll tolerate it and you have some use for the oddball ports and you don't need a lot of options, it might be something to look at. It does cost about $20 more than most of the boards in this lineup, so whether it makes sense for you is just going to depend on your budget and what kind of functionality needs you have. But don't count it out. Hey y'all, you know what time it is. I exploit a cat who's cute to tell you to hit that like button if you like the content here or to help you make a buying decision. Hit that subscribe button if you'd like to see more stuff from us. Hit that bell if you want to get alerts. And also, if you have questions, leave a comment below and mention me, and I can usually answer within a day or two. Thanks, and look forward to more videos from the Arcade Stick.
The Arcade Stick.